This meeting is being recorded. Okay, oh, good. It's good to know. So I'll just do a quick introduction. There's some information about ODLAA, the Open and Distance Learning Association of Australia. And just to say that one of the big attractions of this association is the journal called Distance Education. And of course, we have Som here with us today and Antonina, who have been working on that for many, many, many years. The topics of our webinar series, for the most part, actually all of them so far this year, have been led by authors of articles in that journal, and today is no different. So I'd like to formally introduce you to the lead author of the article that we're hearing a presentation about today. It was published in the February 22 issue of Distance Education. So welcome, Philippa Waterhouse from the Open University in the UK. The article was called, or is called, Distance Education Student Satisfaction. Do work and family roles matter? I won't say any more, but it's acknowledged that this topic is a really, really important one. I mean, the lives of a student, often in higher education, we forget. It's easy to forget that students are more than the time that they spend studying, and they have more to contend with other than their study time. And we see the impact of the outside life or life beyond study in distance students quite a lot, the impact of that on their studies. So it's a very important and interesting piece of work that you have done, Philippa. We're dying to hear more. So I'll hand it over to you to lead us through the presentation. Everybody else, as we go along, I mean, Philippa might invite comment along the way, but you're very welcome to pop questions and comments in the chat, and we'll make sure that we attend to them at some point during the session. So over to you, Philippa.
Thank you. So just a bit of background before I start. So I did this research with Open University students. So the OU is the largest distance education provider in the UK, with over 175,000 directly registered students. Whilst there's no typical OU student, approximately 70% of our students are working either part-time or full-time. The Open University is also open in the sense that to study many of our undergraduate qualifications, there's no prerequisites. So we have quite a diverse profile of students in terms of their previous educational qualifications. So some of them have no GCSEs. These are the qualifications in England that are normally sat around the ages of 15 to 16. Some have A levels or equivalent. So these are normally the qualifications that students have on entry to university. And then some of our students have previously studied a higher education qualification previously before doing their degree with us. So it's quite a mixture on the courses. The analysis that I'm going to talk about today also comes from a larger project where we also considered the linkages between students' work and family responsibilities and their mental distress as measured by symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. We also collected qualitative data on the strategies that students use to manage their multiple responsibilities, and also the perceptions of the support available to them. So I won't have time to go into all that today, but I'm quite happy, to touch base with people if they're interested. They can contact me by email as well. I'm quite happy to do that. So just a bit of background of why we decided to look at, we obviously looked at mental health, but why we also decided to look at student satisfaction. So when deciding which university to apply for, students' perception of the quality of the university and the institution's academic reputation can be key factors that influence their choice. So in the highly competitive environment of student recruitment, student certification scores are increasingly becoming an important marketing tool. And I've just here plugged, some of the articles in the UK that kind of highlights how these student certification scores are talked about in the press, and also league tables. The global COVID-19 pandemic has also started changing the online education marketplace, where traditional higher education institutions who predominantly have offered just face-to-face teaching had to rapidly overnight go onto online delivery. So students who may have expected to study on campus may have found themselves and may still be studying predominantly online. As we move into sort of this, I don't like to say post-pandemic, but as we start moving, into this new phase, traditional campus-based providers may continue to employ distance learning strategies for some of their courses, or develop new offerings should they discover there was a benefit. So, for example, institution that I external examined for before the pandemic, they only offered their stats course on campus, but now actually they're offering two versions of the courses, one on campus and one online, with this online delivery for students who are working. So I think this is kind of a timely topic about student certification in the distance learning online environment for both institutions who are predominantly distance learning, but also for these traditionally based campus-based institutions that may be expanding their offerings in this area. So student certification reflects attitudes of contentment or displeasure arising from students' evaluation of services and their experience relative to their expectation. When I was reviewing the literature, it seems there's a lot of research on student certification in distance education, particularly in relation to students' perceptions of their interactions, in terms of interactions with the learning materials, interactions with their peers, and also interactions with their tutors. There also seemed quite a bit of literature about student certification and association with students' own skills in navigating the online environment. But it seemed less attention has been directed to students' personal circumstances, such as their work and family roles, that I was quite interested in. So that's what kind of led us into looking at this. So the concepts of role theory, the concepts of role conflict and role facilitation, we use to help us understand the possible linkages between the work-study interface and individual outcomes, such as student certification. So role conflict describes the challenges that arise when the time taken or behaviours associated with one role may make the fulfilment of another role more difficult. And there's numerous documentation in the literature of the experience of role conflict of mature students with their employment or family commitments. And it seems that the main issue is time or lack of time. So, for example, one research paper found that among those who were withdrawing from distance education, an inability to complete an assignment due to unexpected family demands was a main factor for them choosing to leave their degree. And I think when we think about our students and their work and family situations, we tend to think about the role conflict and how we can help students in this respect. But I think it's also important to recognise role facilitation. And this refers to the positive, possible positive effects where participation in one role can assist or enhance performance of the second role. So, for example, quite often for our students, family can be a source of motivation for them to come back to university. So they say, I want to be a role model for my children, or I want to be a role model for my younger siblings. Or another thing that came up in some focus groups we did is that, I'm studying because I want to improve my family's future and our financial prospects. So one thing when we were writing this article, one bit of feedback that we got was, well, the experience of role conflict and role facilitation is obviously not unique to distance education students. This is also experienced by mature students with work and family responsibilities, attending face-to-face courses, which I completely agree with. But we thought that the experience of distance education students might be unique, or it's important to look at this group separately to face-to-face students. And we thought this for two reasons. The first is regarding expectations. And I think one of the reasons people choose distance education is because there's this perceived flexibility. And, some people can say, well, I chose to study with X and X institution because I have pre-existing work and family commitments, and studying this way will help me, combine everything and manage everything. So it could be where in circumstances when conflict is experienced, this might be contrary to their expectations of what the learning would be like, and this then might have an effect on their satisfaction. By contrast, students engaged in face-to-face education may anticipate greater conflicts, and in some circumstances, scheduled time on campus might actually provide these students with clearer boundaries that may assist them in the managing of their multiple roles. And I think some of this would be fascinating to explore in more depth in qualitative research about expectations and how then this might link to satisfaction. Another reason why we thought the distance education student group is a bit different and important to look at separately is also the different nature of online distance education can pose additional challenges for students. And then these challenges can be compounded by the time pressures already faced by those experiencing intensive work and family commitments, and then consequently that may impact their satisfaction. So in the in-depth study of 5 online distance education students, Renoksky and McElderry argued that all new students transitioning to higher education must adapt to new academic standards and the academic expectations of universities. But online distance learners also are required to navigate additional levels of transitions. And in particular, this is a transition to quite an extensive and sometimes complicated online environment. And if institutions are anything like the OU, we're constantly going through updates and changes to our online environment. So this kind of adaptations for students can be an ongoing process. So when you've got work and family commitments, spending the time to kind of adapt and get used to online environments can be an additional pressure. So what we explored to do in this paper was to explore whether the paid worker role or the family role predicted distance education students' satisfaction. We also then wanted to examine the relationship between role conflict and role facilitation regarding their satisfaction, and then lastly to investigate the role of social demographic characteristics as potential moderators in the relationship. So what did we do? The Open University provided us with the contact details and demographic information of a sample of students studying at level 3 undergraduate modules in the School of Health, Wellbeing and Social Care, which is where I work, and the School of Education, Childhood, Youth and Sports, which is within the same faculty. and they provided us a sample of 1,436 students. So we sent them an online questionnaire, and we estimated that it took about 15 minutes for students to complete. We piloted it beforehand with a small number of students. We collected information on students' work status, their partnership status, whether they were co-residents with children under the age of 18 or younger, at least 3 days a week, and whether they were an unpaid carer. As I mentioned previously, we also asked about symptoms of mental distress, which we did using a standardized self-reported measure, the DASH-21, which has been used previously at the Open University and also in higher education student populations. In terms of student satisfaction, we measured this in response to the statement, "In general, I am satisfied with my educational experience at the Open University." Participants were required to select a response to the statement on a 5-point scale, ranging from 1, strongly agree, to 5, strongly disagree. Due to small cell sizes, for the purpose of our analysis, we created a 3-category variable, indicating whether they strongly agreed with the statement, whether they agreed with the statement, or whether they were in non-agreement. So that last category collapsed, neither agree or disagree, disagree, and strongly disagreed. In terms of our conflict and facilitation measures, what we did here is we drew on the literature and on established measures in the work-family literature, which is a lot more established than the work-family study conflict literature. So we adapted for work study conflict and family study conflict, we adapted measures from Netter Metters and colleagues' measure of work-family conflict and family-work conflict. So an example of how we changed this is the item, "the demands of my work interfere with my home and family life," was changed to "the demands of work interfere with my university studies." Each scale was formed of 5 questions with a 5-point scale response. And the scale response ranged from 1, strongly disagree, to 5, strongly agree. The mean score on each of the 5 item scales was used, and higher scores on our conflict measured indicated higher perceived conflict. We measured work study facilitation and family study facilitation using an adaptive measure from Greywitz and Marks, and this measure was of positive spillover from work to family. So an example of how we adapted this measure was the item "skills I use when I am with my family are useful in my job" was changed to "the skills that I use when I'm with my family are useful for my university studies." And again, each scale was accompanied by a 5-point response ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and higher scores indicated higher facilitation between roles. As mentioned earlier, we also included some open-ended questions in the questionnaire that asked about how students, their strategies they use to combine work or family alongside their studies, also about sources and perceived effectiveness of support and university resources used, and also if they had any suggestions to improvements to existing OU support. So in terms of our response, we got a response for 348 people, which is a response rate of 24%. We excluded a small number of individuals who had some missing individual information. So that took us down to a total of 318. 88% of our respondents were female. To some degree, that did reflect the demographics of the modules from which we sampled from. I think this is a reflection that a lot of the modules did come from the School of Health, Wellbeing and Social Care. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the OU has quite a diverse student population in terms of their educational backgrounds. In our sample, at the time of registering at the Open University, 24% had less than A levels, 41% had A levels or equivalent, and 35% had already attained some form of higher education qualification. Just under 70% of our sample were married in a civil partnership or cohabiting at the time of the survey. Just over 50% were co-resident with children aged 18 years and younger in their household. And then whilst just under 70% reported they were not an unpaid carer, and here we used wording from the England and Wales census around being an unpaid carer to collect this information. So whilst just under 70% said they did not provide any unpaid care, 20% responded that they provided 1 to 19 hours a week, while just over 12% provided over 20 hours of unpaid care a week. 89% of our sample reported that in the month before the survey that they had been involved in paid work. So in terms of levels of student satisfaction, in response to the statement, in general, I'm satisfied with my educational experience at the Open University, approximately 3/4 indicated some form of support to the statement. 28% indicated that they strongly agreed, and 48% that they agreed. However, 16% responded that they neither agreed or disagreed with the statement. 8% then indicated some form of disagreement. So we used ordinal regression to analyse the relationship between our independent variables of interest and our outcome of student satisfaction. Ordinal regression is used where the categories of the outcome have a meaningful order. So in our case, it was the level of agreement with our satisfaction statement. In our analysis, we modelled being more likely to report lower levels of agreement with the statement, I am satisfied with my educational experience. All our models controlled for social demographic variables of age, ethnicity, gender, and level of educational attainment at registration. In the first bit of analysis, we looked at the different roles that students reported to see if these were associated with their satisfaction. And what we found is that only whether students were co-residents with children was coming up as significance. So the odds of students with co-residents children reporting lower levels of satisfaction with their educational experience was 1.9 times the odds of students without who weren't co-resident with children. So it seems to be that parents or those living with children seem to be less satisfied with their educational experience here. What we then did is we restricted the sample, our analysis sample, to those who reported that in the last month they were engaged in some form of paid work. And here we considered the relationship between reported work-study conflict and work-study facilitation with student satisfaction. And we found that those reporting higher levels of work-study conflict were more likely to report lower levels of satisfaction. Also, conversely, those reporting higher levels of work-study facilitation were less likely to report lower levels of satisfaction. And both these were significant in the models. So it seems that what is important is not just whether students are working or not, but their perceived experience of the combination of their work with their studies. We also wanted to look at whether this relationship between the experience of conflict or facilitation of those working differed by any social demographic variables. So we considered interactions between the work-study conflict and the work-study facilitation variables with our social demographic variables. And we found that the only one that was significant, but we had issues of small sample sizes when we start doing interactions, so we have to keep that in mind. But the one that came up as significant was the interaction between work-study conflict and level of education prior at registration to the Open University. So this figure on the slide shows the predicted probability of not agreeing with the statement that they are satisfied with their educational experience. Along the bottom, we have the work-study conflict score, and then along the y-axis, we have the predicted probability. The different colours in the lines indicate the level of qualifications when they started at the university. The pink line is less than A levels, the kind of turquoise greeny line is having some form of a higher education qualification, and the blue line is having A levels or equivalent. And we can see that the pattern seems to be quite different for the groups that have A levels or equivalent when starting at the OU. For this group, as there's an increase in the work-study conflict score, the predicted probability of them being in non-agreement with the education satisfaction statement remains quite stable. Well, for the other two groups, those with less than A levels and those with some form of higher education qualification, as the work-study conflict score increases, their predicted probability of not agreeing with the educational experience statement increases. So it seems that for these two groups of students, as conflict increases, they are more likely to not be satisfied with their experience. But this pattern is not holding true for those who enter with A levels. We then restricted the sample to those who reported that they were co-resident with a child, or they had unpaid care responsibilities, or they were in some form of partnership. And those reporting higher levels of family study conflict, in this case, were more likely to report lower levels of satisfaction with their education experience. So here, a very similar pattern to what we were finding with those in employment. And again, we were interested in looking at whether relationships between conflict and facilitation among those with family responsibilities differed according to their social demographic characteristics. And again, we found that family study facilitation, the relationship with satisfaction seemed to differ according to people's educational attainment when they started with the university. So again, here we have the predicted probability of non-agreement with the statement about being satisfied with the educational experience. Along the bottom is family study facilitation score, and on the y-axis, predicted probability. Again, the colours are the same. So the blue is those with A levels or equivalent, the pink, those with less than A levels, and the green turquoise colour, those with some form of higher education qualification. And we can see it's those with A levels or equivalent. Again, the pattern seems to be different to the other two groups. So as their family study facilitation score increases, the predicted probability of them not being satisfied with their educational experiences declines. And this isn't seen with the other two groups. So they were our main findings. I just wanted to flag up, some limitations that we had. So obviously our measure of student satisfaction was just based on a single indicator that asked about their overall experience. Also our sample, as you saw a few slides back, was also very homogeneous. So they were predominantly older females and those reporting a white ethnicity. Whilst there was some form of non-response bias, so women were more likely to respond to the survey and older students were more likely to respond to the survey, this demographic does correspond to the demographics of the students on these courses, but it might limit how our results can be applied to other student populations where the demographics may differ. So just some key reflections before we open up for questions and also discussion about support for students. We found that students who were living with children were less likely to report satisfaction with their education experience. Our qualitative analysis of the open questions in the survey revealed that the creation of boundaries and negotiation of expectation with family members is a key management strategies that students use, but quite often it can lead to tensions, including feelings of guilt by the students. So lower satisfaction of students with co-resident children may be the result of matching domain effects. So perceived conflict caused by the studies with their family life and then causes this dissatisfaction with their studies where they see the conflict arises. Generally, conflict was associated with lower levels of agreement with the satisfaction statement and facilitation with increased likelihood to report satisfaction. And then lastly, this relationship between student satisfaction and work study conflict and family study facilitation seem to depend on students' prior educational attainment. So this raised for us the question that, you know, prior educational attainment might have important consequences for students' expectations of what their current university studies would be like and expectations of how they might manage their university studies with work and family commitments. From our data, we don't know that those who had already had some form of higher education experience, whether this was face-to-face education at higher education or whether this was distance learning at this level. Given the role of satisfaction in promoting students' retention, we think that this would be a really interesting area to look at more in depth in using qualitative methods. Cool. And I'll just stop sharing.
Many thanks, Philippa. We had one, did we have one? One comment from Song.
Oh, yeah.
I think we'll generate a few more as things get going. Yes. I'll just scroll a bit.
Just reading.
Okay.
I'm just reading Simon's question in the So Simon asks, is it possible that ledgering of individual roles could or should be built into the learning and teaching activities associated with specific assignments, giving the students the opportunity to relate their learning to real-time lives might support learners more effectively? And I think I totally agree, Simon. So next week, me and my colleague Raj are doing a workshop where one thing we want to discuss is how can us as higher education providers design our courses and design our assessments to support students with these multiple commitments more. And one thing we were thinking about is regards to assessment, where can we give students the opportunity to reflect on what they are learning, how does it apply to their workplace, or how can their real life situations, like you say, how can their family situations, unpaid caring responsibilities maybe, or how can their specific work situations, how can they bring that into talking about assignment? And I think this is the way that we can increase this facilitation between roles. So like I was saying at the beginning, I think we tend to think, how can we reduce the conflict between students' roles? But I think, like you said in your comments here, as well as conflict, we should be thinking about facilitation. How can we design our courses in a way that they can draw on their unique life experiences to inform their studies. And I don't know what others think of that. Jay, I see you've got your hand up.
Well, that was what I was going to ask too. It probably builds on what Simon was saying there. Is, I mean, I was going to ask you, Philippa, and I missed the first bit, so forgive me. But whether the purposefulness of the design of an online course to meet the needs, you know, I mean, quite often, and you know, I'm in the process of writing a paper here about, you know, classroom-based pedagogical practices applied to an online environment that are highly problematic. So that the clustering and the organising of learning materials. Are you able to talk to that? I mean, what happened in that space? Because I understand that the family piece, it's a really important piece, but I wonder whether there was some learning design work or teaching intervention work that sits alongside that to accommodate for those things or the like. It's a bit of a long-winded question, but I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah, so I think you're saying what ways can we intervene in designing online courses to kind of support these students? Yeah, to kind of mitigate. I mean, one thing that we've been looking at particularly in our courses, and it becomes so complicated though, is for students studying full-time, because of course we get some students who do work full-time but then decide to study full-time. They're studying multiple modules. So we've started trying to map out assignment deadlines to try and avoid clashes. And I mean, for some degrees, I think it's possible because there's only certain combinations that you can take, and so you can avoid that. But for other degrees, it's causing me a nightmare at the moment on my degree, because students can come from different routes to do my module, and I'm trying to map against 3 different modules, and I just said I can't avoid a clash. So then it's thinking about, how can I signpost to students in advance at the start of the module, you're going to have a clash possibly in this week between assignments? Because one of the things that students in the focus group said was, when I have an assignment clash, sometimes I feel paralyzed. So I can't even get started on one of the assignments because I just don't know where to start. And one said to me, I couldn't even reach out for help because I just felt so paralyzed. And the only reason she got out of the bind is because her personal tutor happened to email her at that time and say, oh, I'm just checking in. Is everything okay? And she said if it wasn't for that intervention that was random because her tutor didn't know what was going on, she probably would have not submitted either assignment and then got herself into quite a bind. So I guess one thing is there a way that we can, before assignment deadlines, kind of have this automatic check-in process? But again, some students like it, some students don't like it because they would feel they're being checked up upon. So,
and even Philippa, even submission windows work quite well, you know. So rather than having a drop dead date for the submission, you open up the submission for a 10-day window, and they can submit it anywhere within that period of 10 days. That's always a really nice way for online students who are battling the flexibility. You can imagine working full-time doing 4 subjects. In a lot of ways, you're setting yourself up to fail. Really, really challenging. It's a really interesting study, Philippa, because all the work I've done is in online learning, and balancing family work commitments in an online environment, really tough. But yeah, the family factor is a big deal for sure.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's a reluctance for students to also reach out for help because it's seen that this is not academic. So I was even shocked that sometimes when a bereavement is experienced, the student doesn't ask for extension because they don't see that that's a valid reason. Well, as a tutor myself, I would see a bereavement is a really valid reason. So I think it's this expectation setting as well. Sometimes they have expectations of being unrealistic and them not realize how much work it is. But then sometimes they have unrealistic expectations seeing us a bit as robots, I think.
That's the other reason why the assessment window is so nice, because they don't then have to ask for an extension, you know, because they don't feel like they're failing. And, you know, you can imagine you're doing 4 subjects, you're asking for 4 extensions. You know, you're starting to doubt your ability to be an online student and doubt your ability to succeed. But if you got the assessment window, you don't have to go and sort of ask or beg or feel like you failed. Sort of a nice way to work. But
Jay, if I can just add to that, at my university, what they've just introduced is an automatic 48-hour extension for students, so they don't have to ask. They're just, you know, there's, you know, that window should they wish to do that, and we've found it's been very helpful and very well received by our students. It's taken our academics a bit of time to get used to it, and when do they go and start marking and things like that. But you know, that's worked well.
And I think quite a lot of universities in the UK have also introduced that kind of automatic extension windows as well post-COVID. So I think that's a really interesting thing to explore. Sarah, I see you've got your hand up. Sorry, I haven't been ignoring you.
No, that's all right. I have a question or a comment, but perhaps Jocelyn's comment that's just come up in the chat might be good to look at first.
Yep, so Jocelyn says, I am relating this to my context as well, as I'm a working student. I myself would have appreciated a project-based assignment rather than a final exam at postgrad master's level. It would help me relate more closely and practically apply what I learn. Even deadlines, as mentioned by Jay, small concessions such as Monday due dates rather than Friday, at least allowing the weekend to complete work. Yeah, and I agree that, because we have a weird thing at the OU where our due dates is a Thursday, which I find very bizarre, because I think this thing of Monday, because that's when a lot of our students are doing their assignments, are the weekend. So I think the days of the week matter. And I think also with this kind of what we've been talking about with the project-based assignment, I think this kind of idea of having this more independence and them being allowed to choose what their assignments, obviously we have a framework of what the assignment is, but the exact focus, giving them that flexibility and freedom, I think it gives students more motivation to choose what they're learning, you know, what they're applying their learning to, and that's more motivation to do the assignments. So I think there's definitely benefits from that. I think Martin's also just said that he's explicitly had students tell him they only work on class materials on the weekend, largely due to family and work commitments during Monday to Friday. Oh, Simon, have you got your hand up?
I do, but I don't want to steal Sarah's thunder. She had her hand up first.
I was just going to draw attention again to that expectation, the set of expectations. How do you set them? I'm also impressed by those suggestions about how to modify the way that assignments are set, or deadlines are set, or whatever, because they're such small things, really, when you think about it. It's so easy to apply, and yet they can have a big impact on the students' experience and their response to the work that they're expected to do. Expectations of staff and expectations of students. I mean, Martin's comment there about students saying that they only work on their study work during the weekend, and that's a common one, isn't it, really? I mean, and the expectation of a student enrolling in a distance course is often that, well, I work all week, I've got time at the weekend, I'll do my work then, or in the evenings. And when as it happens in my university, many times the assumption is, well, I'll still have a class, but I'll have it live on Tuesday night. It kind of immediately throws up that mismatch of expectations. The staff expect to see students live and synchronously, and students don't, or they want some of it, but not, you know, just comment.
And I think this thing about expectations, I think it's really important in our induction to kind of have sometimes these frank conversations about expectation. What are the expectations of the student? and what are the expectations of, you know, personal tutors or module leaders, and for that to be in any induction. Because I think one thing with sort of online distance education is students can come with these preconceived ideas of what it might mean, and I think it's kind of how we advertise it, isn't it? Because it's this idea that you can study anywhere, any place kind of thing, but it kind of gives this sense that with online distance education there's no space or time barriers, but the reality is there is space and time barriers. They're just different and changed. So I think that's the thing, students can come to this form of education with some expectations. Well, the reality can be a little bit different, so it is still that transition to getting used to it. Yeah. Simon, I'll come to you now. Thank
you. Yeah. I'm desperate to be articulate, not least because I don't want to take up too much time. I think Martin's point is quite pertinent, and what Sarah said too. But I think in part, some of our assumptions, the way we organize education, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, is still very much linked to the agrarian cycles. It's quite old-fashioned when you think about the way we have our terms and the fact that we teach Monday to Friday. I mean, the fact that we teach between 8 and 5, and so when we think about designing any course, as you say, Philippa, we really need to have really frank conversations with each other as a course design team as to all of the assumptions that we're making. So yes, a submission date on Thursday might make sense, and a submission date on Monday might make sense for some, but all of that kind of predetermines then the way we're designing our courses, because if we're designing courses for people who are working full-time, acknowledging that a lot of them will be working full-time, rather than designing the course so that they can do it around their work, we need to design their learning so they can do it as part of their work. And that way we would be, lightening their load. So the idea about kind of time shifting, I mean, I don't want to ramble, but we start talking about TiVos and videos and the impact the video had on television watching figures. And it's like, if we're going to ask students to time shift their learning to suit us institutionally, we might be doing it differently, but we're still imposing a different set of rules and regulations. So, I mean, I think it all comes down to intelligent learning design, intelligent assessment design, and all of those assessments, as you've already acknowledged, really need to be sort of socially and culturally specific. They need to be able to be adapted by the student to their own context, to leverage their own life into their own learning wherever they can. And that would include their workplace as well. Because I know students that literally study on the train going into work, at lunchtime, and on the train going home, because their evenings and weekends, if they've got an 18-year-old, an 18-month-old and a 3.5-year-old, that's it. That their time is actually their weekday times are actually their learning time as well as their work time. Yeah.
No, and I totally agree with what you're saying, and I do think we need to integrate it a lot more into our courses. Although what you say about the different timings, I think for some professionals, so this is because we did this research with Education, Childhood and Youth School, they actually said, well, I think we could shift the time. I would quite like the course to start not in October, because I'm starting my teaching in October. So actually starting this course in October does not work for me. And like you said, we're setting it to when it suits us to start the course. And we have these times, October, in the UK, it's October that we generally start. Well, those in education students were saying that's really not good. And then over the summer, we don't have any studies. Well, actually, I would quite like to study in the summer because I'm not teaching. So I don't think there's a one size fits all approach as well. Som, I've realized you've got your hand up and we've only got a few more minutes, so I'll come to you now.
Well, just a quick one then in that case, because I think we all agree on this one, but as I was reflecting on the paper in the editorial, if some of you might have seen that the title of the editorial is Reimagining and Reengineering, and I think Simon was leading towards that. I mean, this is a very, you're talking to the converted here. We all know what to do and how to do it, but there are institutional pressures and constraints to get things done. So I think we got to move this conversation out of this academic community to the senior management committee to say, how do we need to reorganize the institutions in order to be able to do the sort of, look, there's nothing new about pressure. I've been reading articles about the problems that distance education students have since the 1980s, right? This is not new. And people would argue that other kinds of students, full-time students, face-to-face students, young students also have pressures of different kinds, that are equally important. And I think in your last slide, you did say that that's where this research should be going, to look at what are the different kinds of pressures. But I want to bring this conversation back towards pointing the finger at our choreographies, how institutions organize. And Simon did mention this. We are way past the agrarian phase, isn't it? And the bold institutions should be now thinking about reorganizing. The problem is that senior management is so behind the ball, in organizations practically throughout the world, I would like to suggest.
And I think the frustrations for us, like you say, we know the issues, but the frustrations for us is how slow it can be for us to try and get processes or systems to change. At least that's what I find at my institution, that things can be so ingrained, to initiate change can be quite a frustrating process. So I could totally agree with what you're saying there. So I'm just reading the...
Yeah. While you read that, I need to draw this to a close, don't I? It's an hour, and thank you so much, everybody, for your participation and your comments. It's great. The recording, and many thanks, especially to Philippa, for leading us through that. It was fantastic, a really important topic. And the more you dig, the more you see. I think your study provides some insights that perhaps haven't been revealed before, or in that way, using a particular kind of data set. The recording of this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel when we can do that, which should be in the next couple of days. And here's the link to that, in case you don't have it. A reminder to keep your eye on the website and to any notifications that come through from ODLAA or FLANS or ICDE or whatever association that you belong to. We do try to have one of these once a month, usually on the last Thursday, Australian Eastern Standard Time. And there is one scheduled for July. So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you again to Philippa and to everybody here. Wish you all the best. Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.